Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Carlton E. Green. I am the Director of Diversity Training and Education here in the University of Maryland's Office of Diversity Inclusion. It is really my privilege to be able to welcome folks to this conversation today. We have been having a little bit of technical difficulties. I had a little presentation set up for us that had the information for today, but technical difficulties, right? So we're just going to go with this. Before we get into the conversation, I do want to acknowledge that we are here on the original land of the Piscataway people, and we generally have a university land acknowledgement that we use, but that's also a part of the technical difficulties, so I'm not going to try to go through all of that. But we do want to acknowledge the Piscataway peoples, in addition to the suffering that they experience as a result of being colonialized and having their land taken away from them. And that is the land that we sit on here today in Prince George's County at the University of Maryland. Please take a moment to be very much aware of and acknowledging of the folks of the land where you are currently sitting, and acknowledging the peoples from whom that land was stolen. Okay. Today, we are going to have a conversation about racial trauma in the classroom. A little bit of background for those of you who may be new to our conversation or new to this series. So last year, May 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, many universities across the country kicked into high gear, and we were offering online virtual educational resources for our campus communities. Here at the University of Maryland, in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we launched an anti-racism teach-in series that you can access through the ODI website, webpage on YouTube. In addition to that, our colleagues over at the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies, led by Dr. Tita Chico, also launched an anti-racism series. And I want to give you a little bit of information about that particular series because we're the kickoff for their second year here for you all today. So a few things about that. The anti-racism research, teaching, and public engagement series that was sponsored last year was really done to support and act upon the statements of solidarity for Black Lives Matter issued by the department, the college, and the university, the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, or the College of Arts and Humanities, in honor of the Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III's death, and in recognition that the University of Maryland was built in the mid-19th century on the original homelands of the Anacostan and Piscataway tribal nations. They ended up with a series that had 66 speakers across 22 different events. And if you'd like to have access to those, they are also available on YouTube. Dr. Chico and I did a virtual conversation a few weeks ago, and you can go to that as well to capture a little bit of some of the highlights for Dr. Chico, as well as some of what she learned. We thought that it was I really enjoyed being in conversation with her talking about the series, and so I encourage people to check that out. One of the things that was most amazing about it, in ODI, we were trying to conceptualize this too, but our friends in the English department made it actually happen. They actually published a symposium with the Los Angeles Review of Books that included 25 authors writing 12 essays and also 5 different written conversations. Really encourage you to check out that resource as well. And Dr. Chico is adding those to the chat for you if you'd like to be able to get to those. Coming up, she will be, I think today, they're dropping a podcast about the series, about last year's series as well as the upcoming series. And that's going to be coming out from the American Vandal, and it'll go live today. So you can feel free to check that out as well. Dr. Chico will provide a link for that. And finally, we want to just acknowledge that the chair of the English department, Dr. Amanda Bailey, has written about this work, about her work, and on the occasion of Netflix's The Chair and Inside Higher Education. You should check out The Chair. It's quite thought-provoking if you haven't just yet, right? But this year, the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies is going to be continuing their series. And the title this year is Anti-Racism, Communities and Collaborations. We are the kickoff for this particular series. So today, racial trauma in the classroom. We want to really be able to talk about a phenomenon that doesn't necessarily get addressed. One of the ways that I try to introduce this conversation when I'm around campus, and many of you have heard me say this before, is that we don't always talk about the harm, the injury, the consequences of racism. We may be able to talk about some other forms of oppression as being harmful, but it's really difficult for us to tell the truth about how harmful racism is for people of color, and also in some ways how it also harms white folks too, right? Today, we want to focus on this conversation about racial trauma in the classroom, featuring two wonderful, wonderful people. One of them is a good colleague for me, and Dr. Chico also recommended somebody. And so we were like, great, we can pull these two people together. This will be an amazing moderated conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to invite them to come on and actually introduce themselves. Dr. Mitchell, do you want to unmute and introduce yourself first?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to acknowledge that I am coming to you from the unceded traditional lands of sovereign nations, including the Shawnee, the Miami, the Lenape, the Delaware, and the Wyandot. Central Ohio is really a space of evacuation for Native populations. Indigenous populations here fought back so vigorously that they were basically pushed out. And so there is no recognized tribes in this area. The other thing I want to say about that from my standpoint is that, part of what the 1619 Project has done is make me really aware of the way that African Americans have been fighting to try to make this country live up to its claim of being a democracy since 1619, right? 2019 was the 400-year anniversary of that endeavor. But part of what I'm grappling with is the degree to which very often as African Americans are trying to assert their US citizenship, they are also very much participants in settler colonialism. And so I want to acknowledge that because that is a basic acknowledgement that US education encourages us not to make. And I want us to see that that encouragement that we're receiving is violent, no matter how religiously we look away from the blood on our own hands. So my name is Koritha Mitchell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am actually a proud graduate of the University of Maryland, College Park. I finished my PhD there in 2005, and I have been at Ohio State University ever since, so a little more than 16 years. Time goes by really, really quickly. But I think the only other thing I'll say about myself is I'm really proud of my first book called Living with Lynching. I very much study violence in all of its forms. So in 2011, I published Living with Lynching. In 2018, I published a scholarly edition of the 1892 novel Iola Leroy, which was another opportunity for me to think through the questions that today's conversation will be about, because I'm interested in the violences that are done when we don't acknowledge whiteness and its power in the classroom and in our research. So my scholarly edition of Iola Leroy makes it hard for teachers to ignore how whiteness has been shaping what they're doing. And then in August of 2020, my latest book, From Slave Cabins to the White House, came out, and it just came out in paperback. I call it My Gorgeous Girl because it's just freaking gorgeous. So that's kind of about me. The only other thing I guess that's relevant to this conversation is I do workshops around scholarly publishing as well as around teaching. I call it responsible teaching in a violent culture. So part of what I'll be sharing in response to today's really rich questions are linked to the way that I approach that kind of work to encourage instructors at every level to really be responsible in what is, by definition, a violent culture of the United States.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Mitchell. We really appreciate it. Dr. Singh.
Yeah, wow. Okay, I have a feeling that this conversation is going to be fire. And thank you, deep bow to you, Dr. Mitchell, for your work. And thank you, Dr. Chico, Dr. Nelson, and Dr. Green. You're just always in my heart in so many ways in our discipline and profession. So thank you for having me here. My name is Anneliese Singh. I use she and they pronouns. I'm currently Zooming from the land of the Creek and the Muskogee, also known as Atlanta, as Georgia, but I'm evacuated from Bulbancha, New Orleans, the land of the Chitimacha. And Bulbancha is the name of the land at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And I have to say, I can definitely talk about my bio, but I hope that as we talk about racial trauma you really keep New Orleans and Louisiana in your hearts and minds. The news cycle has definitely moved on. And we've got a lot of mutual aid going on in Bulbancha and all of the land we now call Louisiana. But not only is climate change real, but we need each other. We need to do the work of racial healing and naming racial trauma and white supremacy and figuring out how our universities, our English classes, like all the classes, actually are sites of healing and naming the things we're going to name today. So thank you all. And to this precious community that's gathered here today, thank you for being here. I do study racial healing, racial justice, queer and trans, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, liberation. I think in my lifetime, as a light-skinned, mixed race, South Asian person, I grew up with a white mom who can trace her lineage all the way back to Scotland, unbroken. Every name, never quote unquote owned anyone. No, none of those white enslaver behaviors have been tracked, but benefited with every generation. My dad was a colonized person, grew up in India, or actually the land that was originally Pakistan before the partition of India. And so I think in my journey as a mixed race person whose skin is sometimes light, often darker, sometimes in between, often a racial Rorschach is what I've learned to call myself, to be able to claim who I am and understand that people project onto me what they need me to be. I am committed to really for the rest of my life looking at how I've internalized anti-Blackness and how my life has benefited from Indigenous erasure. And so that brings us directly to this conversation about the classroom, because I was trained as a counseling psychologist where we were reading all the white books, learning all the white noise. And so I'm really excited about this conversation today. And so I think, Dr. Green, I appreciate you moderating as well.
Wow, thank you both so much. I think that, what I'm sitting with is thinking about how you have both named whiteness as real culprits in the racism that we all experience. With that being said, I want to go ahead and maybe steer us through the conversation, because I could say so many other things, because I'm actually pretty excited about this. A part of the way that we have been doing the anti-racism teachings out of ODI is that I've always tried to offer a definition of racism, because racism actually is really important to being able to talk explicitly about racial trauma. The definition that I generally use comes from Dr. Kamara Jones, who is the past president of the American Public Health Association. She's currently a fellow at Harvard University, and I think what she's doing is actually working on some interventions around racism. But I heard her a few years ago in a podcast, or on a radio show, actually, that was a podcast. And she was really an expert in this conversation related to whether or not the city of Milwaukee should declare racism a public health crisis. And we know that that public health officials have been saying for some time now that racism is a public health crisis. And many Midwestern towns have begun to adopt that as a perspective, looking at the racial inequities that are playing out in their communities. When I heard Dr. Jones on the podcast, I was like, well, this is a definition that makes it really accessible for people. And so this is the definition that I use on campus a lot when I'm talking to folks. So I just want to share these words with you. She says, racism is a system. It's not a personal moral failing. It's not even a psychiatric illness. It's a system of power. And it's a system of doing two things, of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And it does those things based upon so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how we look. Now, what I want to amplify for you is that, especially for those of us who are educators in this space, to be thinking in terms of how it is that this system that structures opportunity in favor of white bodies, that disfavors, that takes away opportunities from the bodies of people of color, how a system that says that white bodies, beliefs, values, and behaviors are more valuable than those of people of color. That's the system of racism that we're talking about. So be thinking about that as we move through this conversation. And then the last definition that I want to share with you is one about racial trauma itself. In the work that I do, the definition that I use is this: the emotional and psychological response to racial incidents that are unexpected, experienced as threatening, and result in significant psychological stress. There are three components there: unexpected, experience is threatening, and resulting in psychological stress, right? I don't want to go into those because now I want to invite our panelists into the conversation. So I've just given that definition. Dr. Singh, can you come on and tell us a little bit about how it is that you describe and how you discuss racial trauma when you're doing this work?
Oh, well, I love Dr. Kamara Jones. I mean, if you please follow her work, I think the way that she defines racism and has been talking about racial trauma has been really transformative. I mean, definitely we've had Black scholars for many, many hundreds of years talking about white supremacy as a system. So she's that next breath, right? But I think what I would add to what she's kind of defining is that these different levels she talks about, you know, moving from the individual and who's targeted, who's not, you know, there's this vicarious aspect of racial trauma that's also playing out. You know, you might not be quote unquote directly targeted, but you know, as a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous person of color, you know, might be just kind of soaking it all in. And I think, you know, we tend to see and focus, if we do focus at all on what white supremacy is, on folks of color, bodies of color. And there's this really tricky trick thing that white supremacy does, where it's like, well, we've got to stop that racism thing. You know, we got to end racial trauma. We got to help these BIPOC students and these BIPOC faculty, and we've got to recruit and retain these bodies. And all the while, white supremacy is looking away from white culture. And so we don't talk about what the real push out is, where the real pain is. And, you know, it is an interesting kind of, I don't know if quandary is the right word. It's a trick, right? White supremacy gets you to look to one place, to look away from another. And so I think in doing that, you know, I really lean on Resmaa Menakem, one of my mentors, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, wonderful book if you haven't gotten it, where he really talks about, you know, racial trauma is something that goes back, we know from the epigenetics of trauma, it goes back 14 generations. So it's easy to think about Black communities, Indigenous communities, Asian Pacific Islander, Latinx communities, multiracial communities, and think 14 generations back of intergenerational trauma. But what is less easy to think about is, ooh, my mom's family, white dominance, 14 generations back, that superiority, that part of racial trauma that we actually don't define as trauma, but actually is the thing that is keeping it going. So I think it reminds me about kind of the discussions of like, remember like violence against women, you know, good old second wave feminist and even third wave and fourth would be like, hey, violence against women, that sounds so passive, right? Okay. So racial trauma has this thing where it sounds kind of passive and we want it to end, but we're never really naming the white brutality that's at the source of it. So I would imagine, Dr. Mitchell, you have quite a bit to say on this one. I can't wait to learn from you.
That is a perfect that is a perfect entry point for me, because in my work, what I'm invested in having us do, as you said, Dr. Singh, when we acknowledge racism, when we acknowledge inequity, we are encouraged to think about the disadvantages of marginalized groups. And what my work is really centered on is what would happen if we took seriously tackling the violence that's embedded in unearned advantage. So I'm much less interested in my disadvantages as a Black woman professor at a Research One institution where, you know, this entire country has taught you that if I'm a Black woman, maybe I have expertise in house cleaning, maybe I have expertise in twerking, but hello, to have your authority be based on intellect? Oh no, none of that makes any sense in the United States. How dare you expect me to think that you have legitimate authority based on intellect? This is madness, right? So what I am more interested in is not my disadvantage in the classroom because we have a society that teaches everyone that my only expertise can be in those other realms, but what about the unearned advantage of my straight white male colleagues who get to walk into the room and be assumed to have earned the position as a matter of course. No one's thinking, oh, well, they're here because they're a straight white man and affirmative action for the entire history of this nation has been for straight white men. No one's thinking that. They think that when I walk into the room. So what I'm invested in having us all do, whatever our location is, whatever our background is to be much more invested in our unearned advantages than we're invested in somebody else's disadvantage. So the framework of racial trauma really is one of those things that allows us to stay focused on that disadvantage of the marginalized group. And I just want to encourage us to at least plant the seed wherever possible to say, no, it's about your unearned advantage. So what about my unearned advantage as someone who is read as cisgender? What about my unearned advantage as someone who is read as straight? Those are things that I need to grapple with, because when I look back on my journey and I figure out, wait a second, part of the reason I was able to get out of my incredibly racist schools, for all the things that I experienced that were horrible, part of what helped me navigate it is that I was a cisgender child. The way that I was able to be so perfectly well behaved was actually partly due to the unearned advantage of being read as being well behaved just by being cisgender and having an expression of gender that did not get read as a disruption. So it just feels to me like whatever our position, we need to be much more invested in our unearned advantages, and the way that simply moving through the world, not acknowledging those unearned advantages, helps us to contribute to the violence that is built into how this nation is put together. Because at the end of the day, I am not here because I made better decisions or worked harder than somebody else. I can name too many students of color from my growing up in those racist, well-resourced public schools who did not fall through cracks. You don't fall through cracks when you're a child of color in this country. They are big gaping holes full of suction. So when I look back at my life and I try to figure out how did I avoid those big gaping holes with suction, part of it has to do with those unearned advantages. I need my white, straight colleagues to be just as invested in thinking about what their unearned advantages are as I have been. That to me is where we can make a difference, because if you just go with the flow, I promise you, you are contributing to someone being crushed right now.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that you're setting us up well for the next question too, but I want to highlight two things that both of you have talked about. Really, that we don't focus on whiteness enough as being really, again, the culprit in all of the racism and racial trauma that we experience. You made me think really explicitly about Toni Morrison, Dr. Singh, right? The function, the very real function of racism is distraction, right? And so if we are looking away from whiteness while trying to pay attention to how do we create more space for these people of color, how do we help these students of color, right? Then we're actually not paying attention to where the harm is coming from, right? And so we have to reorient ourselves to not being distracted in that type of way and really look at what's harmful. And then the piece that you were making me think about too, Dr. Mitchell, is really thinking about what'd you say, the holes of suction that people get lost in. You're making me think about how it is that we don't talk enough about whiteness being able to protect people, to protect white people from the consequences, and it also assigns them a level of perceived competence that they may actually not have, right? That they also then get just pushed along because of that. But on the shadow side of that, whiteness generally has low expectations for students of color, which can be really, really harmful. Even well-meaning white teachers can have really low expectations for students of color, and that is actually pretty harmful in the classroom. And so with that, can you talk a little bit about, Dr. Mitchell, what does the experience of racial trauma mean for students of color in the college classroom? Like, how does it affect their capacity to engage, to learn, to retain, to perform? Talk to us about what you see or what you think about that.
Well, I mean, given what you just said, I would place the emphasis again on low standards for white people, because Absolutely. We need to speak in terms of whiteness because we understand that whiteness is more about discourses and practices, not about individual people, right? And so part of what I'm invested in is having us think about how our society has been structured to lift up whiteness such that the standards for white people to consider themselves good and decent are incredibly low. So part of the way that this comes into view for me, I did a podcast for C19, the Society of 19th Century Americanists, that I called The N-Word in the Classroom, Just Say No. And the reason it's linked to your question is because at the end of the day, right, in these 16 years that I've been a professor at Ohio State University, one of the things I know is that Ohio State is not unique at all in its racism, sexism, etc. And so the fact that I have lots of colleagues, not only at Ohio State, but throughout the profession, who use racial slurs in their classes and don't at all think about the power of a white person using those racial slurs in their classroom. The fact that that happens so often is a function of the incredibly low standards that white people are encouraged to hold themselves and each other to, because it's not as if I'm the only one who knows they're doing this. So if white people actually held each other to higher standards, right, that your teaching would actually be judged on whether only white students can thrive in your classroom? Are white students the only ones who don't have some kind of, emotional thing to work around to be successful in your classroom? If that actually were part of the culture that were cultivated in these departments, then we would have a very different situation. So to my mind, what you're having me think about is the power of having whiteness be this driver that actually encourages white mediocrity, such that, okay, as long as I'm not using racial slurs in my classroom like I know that guy is, then I must be a fabulous teacher. No, how about maybe I should be contributing to a culture more broadly that actually allows all of these students to thrive, not just my white students, not just the students who don't have to move around my homophobic slurs and so on. So to my mind, that is where I would want to put our emphasis, not so much, and again, I think Dr. Singh's work is more to the issue of racial healing and so on. I just want to be honest about where my emphasis is, which is about the violence that is done when white mediocrity gets to parade itself as merit, right? The fact that the standards are so low that no one is actually testing and asking white professors, what standards are you actually holding yourself to that are objective, that have to do with actual results? Is it simply that we're always assuming you just belong, unlike Koritha, who walks in the room and we're like, oh yeah, affirmative action? So that's where I'll leave that.
Dr. Singh, do you want to add about or follow up on that or talk about the effect of students on students in the classroom?
Well, I love what you said, Dr. Mitchell. I mean, I think violence and racial healing, you can't have racial healing if you don't talk about the violence, and the violence just keeps coming if white folks don't consider that part of their own racial healing is to look at that unearned advantage you were talking about. I mean, this question I love too. I think it's important, Dr. Green, like, what about the experience of racial trauma for BIPOC students in the classroom? It's a real thing. We know, we can look at research and we can see the retention rates. We can see engaging academic performance. We can see all that stuff. Again, what we don't see is the system of white supremacy that's holding those rates up and what it would be to really transform. We are trained, all of us, whether we're white or BIPOC, in historically white universities, unless we went to an HBCU or an HSI. And even James Baldwin called in HBCUs, especially like, oh, you're HBCUs, but you're teaching white, you're teaching white. And I think within that kind of teaching white kind of environment, you're always going to have BIPOC students and faculty adapting to that whiteness, that demand to adapt. And then there's always going to be BIPOC refusal, right? So I kind of see it as like, you know, the patient in the classroom is certainly racial trauma as a symptom, and it's terrible, it's wrong, it's all those things. But we can't look at the symptoms. We have to treat the patient of white supremacy, which tends to be, when we look at the numbers of who's teaching these classes, it tends to be a white doodly teacher, a cisgender straight teacher, you know, even as, you know, cis white women are making huge inroads into the academy. The folks that are still making decisions as you go higher in universities tend to be white and more masculine identified. And so, you know, you've got to think about that hierarchy that kind of creates and defines that teaching space on the ground. And then I think we can start to talk about racial trauma in the classroom. Like, what is the through line between how decisions are made at the top to what's going on in the classroom? My colleague and friend, Dr. Bettina Love, she talks about spirit murdering, you know, kind of the really robbing of Black culture, especially Black boys culture in K through 12 setting. But, you know, you can also think about how that plays out in higher ed and historically white institutions. You can train faculty all day to like reduce racial trauma, but have we had a conversation about what it would mean to actually have a culture that isn't solely white guiding the classroom? That demands an imagination. It demands accountability and talking about what violence has happened previously. It requires faculty to talk to one another, which is not how the academy is set up. We are set up to compete with one another, to like try to get along, but not really. And so I think I just lay out those dynamics to say you can talk about the specifics of what's going on in the classroom, but because racial trauma is insidious, it's always going to collect itself. And so the one intervention is never going to work. You actually need a wholesale transformation. And then people throw their hands up and they're like, oh, we can't do that. But it's like, yes, we can. We not only can, there are people who are already doing it. The Abolitionist Teaching Network, there's so many generations of abolitionists who have done this work. We just need to follow their compass and change and create that cultural humility. So I know that's a longer answer, but I think that if white supremacy is in the air we breathe, it's in the water we drink, it's all around us in the classroom, we've got to look at that intergenerational racial trauma that's rooted in white supremacy.
Thank you for that. Go ahead, Dr. Mitchell.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here just because that rich answer has me thinking about maybe an example that feels really concrete to me, which is more an example of how I feel I both acknowledge that racial trauma is a real thing, but also acknowledge the way that the project that we're engaged in terms of abolitionist teaching is an ongoing thing and isn't happening tomorrow, right? So one example for me is, and I think this is linked to your question about your acknowledgement that sometimes well-meaning white teachers can have incredibly low standards for low expectations for students of color, and they don't recognize it. So one example that comes to mind for me around this is the way that I have seen professors, I trained professors in lots of different points in my career. So I have seen white professors all of a sudden not mark grammar issues in the papers if the paper were about Cinco de Mayo or something, right? Not mark basic kinds of syntax things if the paper were about Juneteenth, right? Like all of a sudden, these standards go out of the window and they're not trying to actually bring that student to a certain level. And to me, part of what this is linked to is sometimes the way that we can take something like awareness of African American vernacular English or Ebonics or whatever people want to call it, we can take an awareness that that might exist and then end up using it as a tool against those students without knowing it. So in my own teaching, what I'm invested in is making sure that I'm explicit with everyone about how so-called standard English is going to be weighted differently because we're in a racist society. And part of what I do is even bring up the issue of pronunciation and how racialized pronunciation is. And so I'll, write on the board a word like police. Do you pronounce that police or is it police? And I'll go through a couple examples like that sound different in African American vernacular English. And then I'll give a couple of British examples. So like the Thames River, which is spelled Thames. And it's just like, if it were really about phonetics, would that be pronounced the Thames? And so I just show my students, like, we have very racialized understandings of what is proper pronunciation, and that is linked to a hierarchy. It's not linked to the actual value of the thing. So part of what I think that does is it allows students, especially students of color, to see that, no, I don't want you to miss out on just how much you will be judged negatively. But I also want you to know that you don't have to take that value system internalized. And so that's an example to my mind, Dr. Singh, of like the middle ground that I'm always trying to work in right now, that it's not going to go away. So part of how I hold students to a high standard, to your point, Dr. Green, part of how I hold them to a high standard from an academic standpoint is to say, yes, these are the ways that I'm going to judge it because we're in this system, but that doesn't mean that your value as a person is attached to it. I need you to know the difference so that you don't internalize all of this racist BS.
It really makes me, pulling together what Dr. Singh was offering from Dr. Love's work about spirit murdering. It was making me think about how the modern day institution, University of Maryland, Tulane, Ohio State, may actually still be invested in colonialism if we are indeed murdering the spirits of our people of color students, right? Because in some ways that's about disappearing their uniqueness. It's about robbing them of the energy and creativity that they bring to the classroom sometimes, if in fact we are still using white supremacist standards in order to be able to evaluate and teach them, right? So we have to really be concerned about, again, naming whiteness and white supremacy as this real dangerous force in all of this, right? So I really appreciate it, not just focusing on racism, but how do we focus on white supremacy? It kind of also makes me think about, talking about students, let's talk about faculty, because this can oftentimes be a silent conversation. We don't necessarily, because we're in institutions and we always want to talk about what we do for students and how we want to serve them, we can forget that faculty of color can also be negatively impacted by racial trauma, whether or not that's in the classroom or in a department meeting or in some other type of administrative function. Dr. Singh, can you help us understand, or can you talk a little bit about the effects of white supremacy and racial trauma on faculty of color?
Oh, this feels like the dirty little secret we're not supposed to talk about in front of white folks. So white folks, I'm going to talk about this, but it's time to take some action. I think that for BIPOC faculty, just when I think about my own journey, I just think that so many of the generations who've survived historically white institutions before us, that racial trauma is in them. And so that gets passed on to us again, the survival strategies. And we tend to not talk to one another as BIPOC faculty about, we reach to each other. We try to tell each other. We try to warn each other. We try to resource each other. We try to mentor each other. We start our affinity groups. We care, we talk to people in whispers, and we have big voices in faculty meetings, and we teach one another all these survival skills. But it's kind of like that version of when my dad told me not to bring my Indian food to school and heat it up, it's like, he wasn't really talking to me about the roots of white supremacy, and that actually it didn't matter if I spoke in whispers, or if I spoke in a big, bold voice, like the same patterns are going to happen over and over. And so I think part of healing from racial trauma, which is that white supremacy for BIPOC faculty, for us, it's about realizing there's no way we can contort or conform ourselves to fit. There's just, it absolutely will not ever happen. However, if we use the institution's tools, I don't want to say to our own advantage, but to our own transformation, I think that's why we come in. We come in with a generational charge. There's a reason we come into becoming faculty. And so I think staying very closely aligned to our boundaries, it's not just self-preservation, but in my culture, we call it dharma, like your purpose. And even if you're atheist or agnostic or identify as a non-believer, what is that reason you became a faculty member? Staying really close to that and holding it so precious, right? With boundaries. And then white faculty, it's time to get to work. It just is. I mean, taking on additional service, mentoring additional students, like teaching additional classes, stepping into leadership with cultural humility, so that BIPOC faculty, we can rest and we can have those places to do that dharma work. I think that form of reparations on multiple different levels is sorely needed. And I think in some ways this kind of goes back to what BIPOC students experience in historically white institutions, that there's some imposter phenomenon that's always talked about, like we somehow don't fit. And that is true. But the truth is, as my colleague, Dr. Sherelle MacArthur says, we're not the imposters, it's them. I mean, for BIPOC students and faculty, we have jumped so many hoops. It's just so important to return to who we truly are and to center that and realize that we're not the imposters, it's them. And to let the white folks do that work of undoing racism. It's not our job. We didn't create it. So I know that there's a lot to be said about this. I know we're also getting short on time, so I want to pitch it to Dr. Mitchell as well.
Well, and that's a perfect, setup, because for me, what it really comes down to is recognizing the violence of white mediocrity, that white mediocrity gets to be treated as if it is merit, so that, not only does it get treated as merit, but also white mediocrity is an incredible shield for white villainy. There is so much, overt violence too being done in these institutions, and white colleagues know it about their white colleagues, but they're not stepping up, because as long as they're not the villain, they don't feel any responsibility. So the question is about, BIPOC faculty. What I would say for me is that it has been so powerful and healing, frankly, to recognize the violence of white mediocrity and to recognize how, being invested in having low standards for people who benefit from whiteness has really made the most natural response to Black and Brown excellence. The most natural response is what I call know your place aggression. If you're succeeding, that's all the more reason why I need to remind you that you don't belong. If you're succeeding and you're a woman, that's all the more reason why I need to remind you that you're not a team player, you are a B, like all of these easy ways that anyone in a marginalized group is reminded of their so-called proper place. So for my money, part of what has been healing as a faculty member of color has been to recognize how much I am put in my so-called proper place precisely because I'm doing everything the institution says it values. It says it values these things. And then I live up to that standard. And here's comes somebody who is, whether they realize it or not, invested in putting me back in check. And so to me, that has been really healing, to recognize this tendency to tell me in so many ways to know my place, and this tendency to let white mediocrity have ridiculous amounts of success. This is a practical exercise, Dr. Green. that I recommend. And I recommended this in print. So please know that I'm not just saying this because, and I wouldn't say it to your face. So one of the things that I have said in an article called Identifying White Mediocrity and Know Your Place Aggression, a Form of Self-Care, is that I very regularly will look around my campus or my profession more generally and say, would that person be here if they weren't white? If we just used objective standards about the quality of their work, would they be here if they weren't white? And very often the answer is no, because you know that a person of color is going to have to be exceptional and they have to put white people at ease. And so it's like, okay, that person is pretty lackluster. If they weren't white, they wouldn't be here. To my mind, that is a form of self-care because I am reminding myself, to Dr. Singh's point, I am far from an imposter. If we actually cared about objective standards and not just whiteness, then I would actually be, revered. But because whiteness trumps any kind of objective standard, that's why that person gets to be held up as if they have merit according to their own standards. So that to me is a very active form of self-care for faculty and students and staff of color.
Thank you so much for that. You're making me think about something that I was sharing with a group of students once before, really trying to get them to understand in some ways that if you have engineered your way into this white supremacist institution that really had not conceived that you would be in this space ever any day, you are really a miracle. You are a miracle, and you have the capability to do miraculous things. But oftentimes, because of the know your place aggression, right, we have our miraculousness taken away from us, right? So in some ways, I think that both of you are still pointing towards how it is that white supremacy does some spirit murdering, not only for our students, but for our faculty of color as well, right? I'm looking at the time as well, Dr. Singh, and I'm wondering if we can just think about combine these last two questions, really, which is about what can instructors do to mitigate the effects of racial trauma in the classroom, as well as how should a faculty member respond when they have been made aware that they are using white supremacist standards or white supremacist behaviors that are fostering racial trauma in the classroom. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Mitchell, and then we'll go to Dr. Singh.
I have literally nothing to say, which is rare.
I have a feeling there's something in there, but I'm happy to get the engine cranked a little bit. I know you just dropped so many gems on us. Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, this is that very common thing that happens in the classroom about, if we haven't just named white supremacy from the beginning of our teaching, we don't name it in our syllabus. We don't, we don't look at who we're reading or what the conversations are going to be like. I don't want to be cheesy. It's just, there's an imagination muscle that BIPOC freedom fighters have always fought for us to use. And it's like, what would this look like if we actually told the truth about what was happening? I think about my history of psychology class. What would have happened if we actually talked about, hey, from the beginning of this class, let's set up some community agreements about, if white supremacy is real, let's just borrow from critical race theory. And if white folks are only going to talk about white supremacy, if there's interest convergence, what are the community agreements we need to learn together, considering that this exists? And, and it then starts a whole different conversation. But I think that as faculty, we're scared to do this, right? Whether we're BIPOC or white. If you're BIPOC, you could get easily targeted. If you're white, I hate to say it, but usually there hasn't been enough self-reflection to do this in a way that doesn't come off as a white savior. So this is a muscle we literally need to work together building. I do think that abolitionist teaching models have really good strategies. Even Adrienne Marie's Brown's book that just came out, Holding Change, is a good one. But if you can think about, what happens when the racial trauma, let's say microaggressions happens in the classroom, often it's not even named, and there's silence around that. So having some role plays at the beginning of class with students, with faculty saying, hey, we're learning too. There is so much of a lie that faculty know this muscle or have developed it. We really have to create it together. And I think in that way, again, I don't want to be too highfalutin and too dreamy, but it's just true. Maisha Wynn's restorative justice work, transformative justice work, it's all out there. We just need to bring it into the classroom and actually enact it. And really, as we're doing that, offering it with a lot of love and accountability. What does a real meaningful apology look like?
Yes.
What does a really real, authentic, transformed classroom look like?
Yeah.
What do you think, Dr. Mitchell?
Yeah, thank you for that, because what you have me thinking about is my classroom covenant that is on my website, and I encourage people to adapt it. But it goes along with what you're talking about, Dr. Singh, that there's a covenant that we create as a community, and we continue to hold it as a document that can be revised as time goes on as a community. And so I think, to your point, for me, what this has looked like in my own teaching is, in the same way that I'm creating community and trying to be accountable in community, especially when I mess up, which of course I do, that it's important that my apology is to the entire community. So an example that I use in that podcast, the N-word in the classroom, just say no, the example I use there was about the fact that the student that I offended actually had dropped the class, but I still came into the class to apologize to everyone and read the apology that I sent to him personally to the entire class. So that accountability and community that Dr. Singh is talking about, to my mind, is where it all is, that we are willing as instructors to continue to learn and to do the kind of practice that builds that muscle that you're talking about.
Thank you all so much for those. I just want to recap a little bit about what you shared, which is we have to be honest about white supremacy culture and how it is so embedded in our teaching practices and in our curriculum, which means also that maybe we need to be thinking about changing our curriculum so that it's less oppressive and more inclusive of the voices of freedom fighters and liberation voices that would be more empowering to all of us and not just to our students of color. We have to be thinking about our community covenant, or the community agreements that we want to have in the classroom, knowing that white supremacy culture is present and that it could be dangerous in the classroom. And then when it does become dangerous, what will our transformative or our restorative practices look like? What will we do to demonstrate some type of public accountability? How is it that we will move into the classroom with some cultural humility to practice in a very public way how it is that we want our students to be accountable to each other when harm occurs in the community? How can we model that for them, right? So I hear you laying down some really practical things for people, and also with some really important resources as well. We have just a few moments left. I'm wondering if either one of you just wants to give some short parting words to our viewers today. We'll start with you, Dr. Mitchell. Does that feel okay?
Sure. Thank you all for being a part of this. Thank you to the organizers for including me in this conversation. The final word that I would leave you with is just the power of getting more invested in your unearned advantage than you are in other people's disadvantage. I think there is a lot of reflection that comes out of that will lead you to the kind of imagination that Dr. Singh has been talking about.
Thank you. Dr. Singh?
Oh, Dr. Green, your summary, and Dr. Mitchell, just your presence and being, thank you for being in conversation. I've learned so much, and thank you as well to our community and organizers. I think I love that we've kept the fire on white supremacy in the focus there, right? To name it. If one of the things we talk about in traumatology in general is that the hardest thing about trauma is it is insidious. It collects itself. And you think white supremacy also does that. You're harmed by white supremacy and it makes you more vulnerable. That is true. And it's devastating. It's heartbreaking. But the truth is, if white supremacy is insidious, it is also true that BIPOC liberation is contagious. And it also collects itself when BIPOC folks, when we reach for each other, when we're not around, we reach for ourselves, we feel that sense of liberation deep in our bones. It's very familiar to us. And so my last thing would be BIPOC faculty, staff, students, just keep recentering in the most bold, audacious way you can. And then, white folks and non-Black folks of color like me, we've got to engage in reparations. We've got to build Black wealth and Indigenous wealth in universities. It is ridiculous. If you look at Black wealth post-Reconstruction, it was 0.5%. Now it's a big whopping 1%. We're not even talking about Black wealth in higher ed. So those moments of reparations that we really have to get clear about, really take some mapping of our units. Don't worry about mapping the freaking university. Map your unit, map your relationships, map the ways that you can move out of transaction and into transformation. And thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you, Dr. Nelson and Dr. Chico. And again, deep bow to you, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. I'm sitting here and I'm just holding, right, the messages that you just given. We really need our colleagues to be more invested and more curious about their unearned advantages, the whiteness that protects and promotes, right? And I hear so deeply in my spirit you offering to the community, Dr. Singh, that we need BIPOC folks to be invested in liberation because that energy is contagious, right? That is beautiful. Thank you all so much for bringing your brilliance, for bringing your warmth, for bringing your encouragement, for just bringing yourselves to this conversation. I feel so full as a result of this. I feel the contagion, right? The liberation contagion, right? As we conclude, I just want to thank not only our speakers, but the folks who are working behind the scenes to make this possible for us today. Dr. Nelson, thank you for being here. To Allison Dickinson, our communications officer in ODI, for all of the work that she did to help get the word out. To you, Dr. Chico, for even thinking of picking up or typing in an email to say, hey, let's collaborate on something. I'm so grateful that we were able to do this. We want to let everybody know that the next installment in this series will feature Honoree Fanon Jeffers, who is the author of The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, which was just named to Oprah's Book Club. We'll be in conversation with Carrie Sananan, who is an assistant professor of English at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And Dr. Chico will make that information available to people. Go out, folks. Be invested in learning about your unearned advantages and spreading some of that liberation energy. Thank you all for being here today.